Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm one of your hosts, Tim O'Toole, and today I have with me two frequent guests of the pod. First is Richard Mojica, expert in all things trade, including tariffs, which we're going to get to in just a few minutes. And the other is Laura Deegan, who is a sanctions expert extraordinaire. And so between Laura and Richard, we will have the sanctions and tariff landscape covered. Welcome to you both.
Hey, Tim.
Great to be here.
Great having you guys back. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about a topic that has come up in our overseas travels quite a bit after the 2024 election. A lot of people are thinking about what is 2025 going to look like in terms of tariffs and sanctions. And so, we did a little bit of prognostication before the election, but I think now that we know who the winner is and who's going to be president next year, we thought we would talk a little bit about both tariffs and trade from a standpoint of what do we think President-elect Trump is going to do. So why don't we start with Richard Mojica to talk a little bit about tariffs. Richard, take it away.
Sure. Tim, the timing of this pod is incredible because there's a lot of action on the tariff front last night, and I say that at the same time thinking that what I say today may be obsolete tomorrow, given the way that
or in 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Or in 10 minutes, we have moved from. This is a flashback to 2018, where trade policy was being, developed through tweet, and now just changed, Twitter to Truth Social, and we're pretty much at the same place.
And Twitter doesn't even exist anymore.
Yeah, Twitter. That's it. That's how the world has changed. Exactly. Leading up to last night, there was a clear message that had been sent by the president-elect during his campaign, which was, in short, that on China origin goods, the U.S. would impose tariffs of 60%. Sometimes the narrative was around tariffs up to 100%. And on the all other goods, so non-China origin, the discussion has been around a tariff of 10 or 20%. So that's been essentially the talk of DC. Which one is he going to do? How is he going to do it? And companies have been preparing for, worst case scenarios. Worst case scenarios, which, by the way, include the possibility of not capping, for example, China origin tariffs at 60%, but rather a stacking view of tariffs, which is if you're currently paying, say, 25%, adding on an additional 60%, and what that would look like and what you would do. So there's a ton of movement around what are we going to do with this kind of amorphous tariff threat, which we know we have to take seriously because tariffs were a big part of the trade policy 4 years ago. But at the same time, we don't have enough details to act concretely. And that perhaps changed a little bit last night. I'm not sure how much, but it has become pretty clear that despite some of the cabinet nominations, which gave the market some confidence that the tariffs would be, that the administration would take a more moderate approach to tariffs, the Commerce Secretary and the Treasury Secretary appear to be on board with the general notion of tariffs, but not exactly, perhaps in a viewed exactly the same way as Trump does. So there was some optimism in the market that the tariff policy, with the inclusion of those two people in the cabinet, would be somehow tempered. And as we were talking about that narrative, especially with the nomination of the Treasury Secretary, and as that was kind of getting some traction to show you how quickly things change, then last night Trump announced over Truth Social that on day one, he will impose a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada origin goods and an additional 10% on China origin goods.
Well, let me stop you there, Richard. So, as I understand it, we have a treaty with both Canada and Mexico, a trade treaty that President Trump negotiated during his first term. I don't think that included for 25% tariffs against both countries. Like, how is that going to be done consistent with that treaty?
It's not. So you're absolutely right. Before the current U.S. Canada-Mexico agreement, the USMCA, we had the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in place. During Trump's first term, he called it the worst agreement ever negotiated and had a hand in renegotiating some pieces of it, and what led to a new trade agreement, which is the USMCA. This USMCA requires a renegotiation or revisiting the terms of the agreement in 2026. So I think what we're seeing here is Trump signaling that he is willing to accelerate those discussions, or at least that he's willing to take a sledgehammer to the USMCA, because obviously, the big thing, or one of the big things that trade agreements achieve is lowering the cost of imports into partner countries. So obviously, a 25% tariff on goods from these countries, not to mention the U.S.'s closest trading partners, really blows things up.
So, question on that. So apart from the treaty authorization, which it doesn't seem like there is, at least what I've heard in the media, not only with respect to Canada and Mexico, but also with respect to China, is that President Trump will start using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is something that Laura and I work with all the time in the sanctions space, but is not commonly, at least to my knowledge, commonly used in the kind of more general trade and tariff space. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, am I hearing right first, and second, kind of talk about how that would work with respect to tariffs?
Yeah, you are, absolutely. And frankly, kind of on the nuances of this act, which is called IEEPA in short.
Yeah, that's all we call it. We don't usually even know what it stands for.
Yeah, exactly. I frankly don't either, but I would have to read it. But it's something that has not been used in the tariff context. So it would be a tool that is, somewhat creative and actually consistent with the way that the tariff policy under Trump has worked, dusting off or using statutes creatively to achieve certain policy goals and or negotiation objectives. And that's one of the things that's so interesting. The tariff threats that came out yesterday are not about some of the other topics that would generally lead to tariffs, but rather they are meant to achieve kind of the dual goals of curbing illegal immigration and regulate and kind of addressing the country's failure to stop the flow of drugs into the country.
So I guess my understanding is the president would declare through an executive order an emergency with respect to the import of drugs within the country, the migrant crisis, and then impose the tariffs by executive order through IEEPA.
That's right. So what a piece we've been waiting to understand is if he were to use IEEPA. IEEPA, by the way, is probably, as far as I know, the only statute that could be used to effectively impose tariffs on day one. So if you were to use IEEPA, as you mentioned, it requires the president to declare an emergency. And that emergency is, broad in nature, the definition of what constitutes an emergency. The statute calls for, it references an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security, foreign policy, or the economy, which, again, we're just kind of waiting to see what the hook will be. And then if the president is able to make the case, right, that there is such an emergency, then that the act authorizes the president to restrict imports. And that's exactly essentially what would happen here. An emergency would be declared. Congress would be consulted, but does not require, Senate approval. And then you would go into the potentially go into an executive order that results in tariffs on a very quick order.
And contrast that with what the normal tariff authority is. So on the other hand, you have the tariffs that were imposed during the first term that didn't involve IEEPA. Like what would the statutory authority be for that, and why couldn't that be used here?
Right. So most of the tariffs, or the most well-known authority, is under the Tariff Act, under Section 232 or Section 301. Section 232 allows the president to initiate an investigation, and then, assuming that they can demonstrate that imports are causing threat to national security, impose tariffs on those imports from the qualifying imports. And Section 301, which is kind of broadly known as the China tariffs, are meant to address issues relating to uneven foreign trade, for example, trade imbalances, or basically the unfair competition associated with trade practices, which is what the U.S. accuses China of doing. So that too led in the Trump first term led to an investigation, which then resulted in 4 rounds of tariffs. So to your question, Tim, that authority is by now well established. I think it has been very hard to challenge the authority of the president's ability to use those statutes effectively. They have largely withheld. So in general, like, the legal challenges have been, he's won every legal challenge.
We've been involved in some of those, and they don't seem to go anywhere.
We've been involved in, right, exactly. And so what makes it different is that if you go through the Tariff Act, then you have to, the administration has to carry out a certain administrative process that requires an investigation, notice and comment, and then the implementation of the tariffs. So IEEPA would allow Trump to go fast.
And I guess that's really one of my questions, and kind of going forward, I would assume that there might be challenges to the president's use of IEEPA powers for this purpose, given that there is a law known as the Tariff Act that has well-established authority, and that essentially it'd be pretty clear, I would think, that the president is using IEEPA to do an end run around congressionally mandated process. Has there ever been any kind of law on that, or is that kind of the brave new world that's going to happen post-tariffs?
I think that's the brave new world. In the past, I think that the USTR, who was involved in the implementation of these tariffs, and just in general, the legal team, the U.S. government's legal team, was very careful to really vet they knew that they would be sued. And my understanding is that they really explored how they would fare in the event of legal challenges. And like I said, as it's turned out, they won most of these legal challenges. And so I don't know what is going to happen. In fact, there are different views as to whether the president's ability to use IEEPA to implement tariffs, as I have suggested, is entirely within what he can do, and will be not questioned, and would likely withstand judicial review.
Well, I think
it's less clear.
Well, I will say at the end of President Trump's last term, apart from the tariffs, he started to do things with respect to the to the National Defense Authorization Act with respect to Chinese military companies. Those actions were actually successfully challenged, in part because the administrative record and the administrative process was much less careful than it was with respect to the tariffs. And so I suspect that, it's going to be kind of a battle between the early Trump 1 term, where they were gearing up for litigation and acting accordingly, and kind of the end of the Trump 1 term, where they were like, let's just do what we need to do, and we'll build the administrative record later, which didn't fare as well. So I guess we'll see how that plays out. Why don't you tell us a little more about kind of China, just writ large, as opposed to the authorities? Kind of what do you think is going to happen with respect to China tariffs? And again, keeping in mind that this could all change in 20 minutes.
Well, it's a tough one. There's an expectation that I think that he will follow through on of an escalating tariff rate around China origin goods, and certainly all the steps that he has taken in terms of the people that he has put in his administration, and all the rhetoric kind of aligns to have a very anti-China protectionist trade policy during his term. The question that there are two big questions in my mind. One is, will this be something where the tariff rate starts at 10% and then, depending on developments in progress, continues to escalate to up to 60%? So in other words, is he fulfilling his promise when it starts at 10 but has the possibility of go at 60? Because he said many times that it would be 60. Or is this just the first, or is this really just a kind of a negotiation tool that may lead to some adjustments in these relationships before he comes to term? That I think is the biggest question that everyone is struggling with. Are these tariffs threats to trade partners meant to change the behaviors of those trade partners so as to extract a deal, or is this a new way of doing trade with the U.S.? Meaning, are tariffs going to be used as a way to protect domestic industry by erecting barriers around what can come into the country?
And if I'm a U.S. company that has China in my supply chain, or a U.S. importer that's bringing Chinese products into the U.S., what should I be doing right now to prepare for Trump's tariffs?
Yeah, that's something that we're talking to companies every day these days, and it really kind of depends on where you are in the supply chain and where you source products from. Obviously, what is different about this time around is that if he follows through on his promise, we have a 10% on all other countries, and therefore you've brought in, this is no longer a China only issue, but many others are now interested in fighting the fight.
Just like the last time around.
Well, the last time around, it was many were willing to fight it, but everyone had kind of the common thread of having a connection to China sourcing. Now you could do a 10% on tariffs on products from Argentina or Brazil or whatever, right? And so there are more people that are going to be interested because they can't they can't live with that 10%, or they need to figure out what to do with that 10%. Do you pass it on to the customer? Do you eat it? Do you split it? That type of stuff. So that conversation, depending on where you are, you're having different conversations. Those that are deeply invested in China and that have found ways to mitigate the effect of the tariffs over time, but would not be able to withstand the effect of an additional 30, 40, 50, whatever it is, are taking very drastic measures, are thinking big. They're thinking, what did Cook do to get Trump to agree to not impose tariffs on Apple products. And let's evaluate that playbook, and let's go all in on some type of lobbying effort that could potentially be helpful, right? That also changes the dynamic where, in a way, there is a technical component to it. There's a very technical component as to how you can restructure transactions or how you can do something under customs law to mitigate the tariffs legally. But because it's Trump, there's also a big component of who do we need to lobby, right? And so part of the conversation for everyone, I think, tends to involve a lobbying component. Does lobbying make sense for you? Where are there natural alliances that can you attack this from a group perspective? Are there if China is likely to retaliate against a particular group, could you potentially team up with that group to fight this fight? I mean, so there's a lot of kind of moving around kind of chess pieces right now to see what would make sense if this does come to fruition. In addition to that, it's usually not kind of across the board fixes, but you can use a number of different customs programs that allow you to lower the landed cost of certain products that qualify. So, first of all, many companies have moved some or part of their supply chain away from from China, at least for the U.S. market. And so, to date, the big thing has been we need to make a product that is not country of origin China, because if you have something that's country of origin Vietnam or Malaysia, you are exempt from the tariffs, right? If those countries now have the 10% tariff, maybe that changes the equation. But if China is still the one with the big tariff rate, as I anticipate it will be, then a big component is what can we get out of China and manufacture elsewhere? And if we are manufacturing in China, is there an argument that we can make that this product is actually not a China origin product under the U.S. trade laws? And we've been successful at proving that in some instances where the product that you're bringing into China is really the essence of the product, and the assembly that occurs is minor assembly. So that's just kind of one example. But also, if you're manufacturing some in China and some in another country, that's another opportunity to say, well, are the finishing steps that are performed in, say, Cambodia, does that change the origin of the product? So all of these types of kind of customs exercises can be very effective, but they tend to be product specific or product line specific, and they don't tend to cut across a company's entire product lines unless the company just makes like a single product.
So it sounds like this time around there's going to be a lot of smaller bore strategies than kind of a general assault on the tariffs. It's going to be more of a how do we exempt our product from the tariffs, or how do we go lobby to change the tariffs in a way that is better for us?
Yeah, something happened during the first term that it's one of the bigger question marks about Trump's second term is will the administration have a tariff exclusion process? During the first term, anyone could petition that their products be exempt from the tariffs on the argument that you could not get the product in the U.S. and that the importation of the product served some U.S. interest. So if this, and many companies were successful in getting products excluded temporarily, but important nonetheless. And so a big question now will be, will this new administration roll out a similar process that would result in companies having the ability to make the case? And then when you make the case, you may have a bunch of good technical arguments, for example, explaining why this is a process that this is something that you can only get in China, and it's very important that you import it into the U.S. because it's supplied to the U.S. government or whatever may be the case. But I think that if it does happen, if we do have that type of process, we're going to have I would think, a tightening of the criteria such that not as many exclusions are granted, and it will go through kind of a very different level of review so that the exceptions that are granted are really the exception and not the rule, right?
Got it. Got it. All right, Laura, you thought you were off the hook here, but I think now that we've kind of talked a little bit about what President Trump is likely to do in connection with tariffs, why don't we talk a little bit about sanctions? I know you and I had a podcast a couple months ago where we thought that maybe President Trump would, do various things, but that was in the abstract. He was still potentially just one of two candidates. Now it's President-elect Trump. Where do you see him going with sanctions policies? We've got a Treasury Secretary in place. We've got a Commerce Secretary in place. I mean, at least nominated, and we'll see if they get confirmed. But we have some real names and faces now to talk about with respect to the Trump 2 sanctions policy.
Yeah, so I think when we spoke last time on the podcast, it might have been before Trump had made a speech to the New York Economic Club, which I think was in September. And he made some comments during that speech that during his second term, if he got elected, he would plan to use sanctions more judiciously. And there was some talk in that speech on focusing more on tariffs. And so I think it somewhat begs the question of, is he really planning to use sanctions in a more piecemeal approach and look at tariffs as another bargaining tool as he sort of had seen sanctions in the past as well? And I think, we have a nominee for Secretary of the Treasury, as you said, Scott Bessent, who had also mentioned in some articles that he sees tariffs as a sort of sanctions. And on the face of it, a tariff is not, by definition, really a U.S. economic sanctions, but it does leave it to be thought about whether that's really the case, and we would see sanctions take a back seat to tariffs. I don't necessarily think that will be the case. I think, we do have another nominee for Secretary of State, Rubio, who is known to be traditionally an Iran, Venezuela, and China sanctions hawk. So I think we could still see more push for sanctions, a ratcheting up of sanctions for China and for Iran, and potentially for Venezuela. With China, as you recall from the first Trump administration, it was Trump who put in place the Chinese military-industrial complex sanctions, as well as the Hong Kong sanctions as well. And granted, these were only pretty limited sanctions, some focusing on publicly traded securities or individual entities or individuals or entities, but I think it's yet to be seen whether we could see more of that in a second Trump term, so more sanctions on individuals or entities in China, as we've seen a little bit now in the Biden administration when it comes to support of Russia's war in Ukraine, or if we could see more full-scale sanctions on China, maybe targeting of certain industries, similar to the way that the Biden administration's done with Russia. I think one thing we might see is more focus in this administration on China and maybe a little bit less on Russia. I think when it comes to Russia, there's been, a lot of speculation about what President Trump will do on day one with Russia sanctions. And I think he said that he plans to try to help end the war in Ukraine before he steps into office. Not sure if that's feasible at this point, but you never know.
Time is getting tight at this point.
Exactly. So I think there's just a lot of speculation. Will he start rolling back some of the Russia-related sanctions that were put in place by the Biden administration and what that will look like? I think there's speculation whether certain large-scale sanctions on Russia, such as a new investment ban or certain import bans or export bans, could be the first to go, while leaving into place some of the more larger-scale designations. So that's certainly something that is feasible, but to go in day one and completely sort of abolish the Russia harmful sanctions regs that were put in place in 2022. I'm not sure if that's
well, let me stop you there with a couple of questions. So on Russia, as I understand it, the Russia harmful foreign activity sanctions regulations, they are not mandated by statute. These are purely IEEPA sanctions of the type that Richard was just discussing, where the president declared an emergency, President Biden declared an emergency, issued an executive order 14024, and a few other ones that followed it. And those executive orders are the pure basis for those Russia sanctions. There's a whole other set of Russia sanctions that are statutorily mandated, the ones that came out in the wake of Crimea. Any thought as to whether or not in the next couple of months either Congress will authorize or the current administration will loop in CATSA, which was the statutory authorization for those sanctions, to essentially make them harder to undo?
I think there are some people that think that, but it's really difficult to see a world in which that happens when you have Congress currently stating that they'll have a lot of support for President Trump's second term. And so, even in the current Biden administration, most of the sanctions that were put on Russia were put under that Russian harmful program. Very, very few sanctions were put on through the statutory authority, CATSA. And so you do have that sort of pathway for President Trump where he can just decide to abolish an executive order or retract an executive order under the Russia harmful program, such as EO 14071, which was the new investment ban. So it is quite easy for him to do something like that. I think where you would find more pushback from Congress is if he starts delisting a lot of Russian oligarchs or other entities, full stop, where I think you might see some concerns from even Republican congressmen on doing so, because there still has been some push from people in the House and Senate on trying to cut off revenue streams from Russia. And even, comments by former Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin had said that his recommendation for the potential incoming Secretary Scott Bessent is really to focus on cutting off revenue streams for Russia. And what does that look like? I mean, that could look like a host of different things, but I think what you will not see is, full-scale delistings on day one. I think you'll see a next, term Trump administration think about what they can potentially do to roll back some of what has been done, but without, a full-scale retraction of it.
Yeah, I saw those comments by former Secretary Mnuchin, and I thought they were very interesting because, at least as I read them, basically he thought that the energy sanctions should be ratcheted up against Russia. That would effectively cut off the revenue stream. Now, the reason they haven't been so far is because there was this desire to not roil the world oil markets, and I suspect that the new administration is probably shares that concern about not rankling world oil markets. So that'll be interesting to see. Well, why don't we turn to China? Back to China real quickly, and you talked about some of the authorities that were already in place. I'm intrigued a little bit by what I heard Richard talking about in terms of President Trump authorizing certain tariffs using IEEPA. An IEEPA order, if he were to declare an emergency with respect to China and use that for some of the new China tariffs that might ratchet up, that could also incorporate sanctions. So we could be at the at the junction between Richard and Laura, where it's essentially you've got on the one hand this executive order that's authorizing Richard's tariffs and Laura's sanctions, and we've got kind of China all in one policy, but the president has a lot of tools to do that. Have we seen any indication that might happen?
So, I mean, I think there, to Richard's point, the use of IEEPA, it's such a broad authority. It allows a president to very quickly enact prohibitions. So I certainly think that there's been a lot of talk of it. I think also, to Richard's point, you could see potential challenges, but I will say that In the 1970s, I believe, President Nixon had used tariffs under IEEPA as an not IEEPA, sorry, it was TWIA, the Trading with the Enemy Act, which is what authorizes Cuba sanctions. And so TWIA was the predecessor to IEEPA. So there's some basis to believe that in case law that this could be a possible use of IEEPA. Something interesting, that I was thinking about when Richard was talking about exemptions for certain companies is whether you could see Treasury or another agency issue potentially licenses or general licenses under IEEPA if they're using IEEPA as an authority to issue tariffs, and whether you could try to carve out certain sectors that way instead. So that's something interesting to think about, but it leads me to think that there will be a lot more collaboration between government agencies like Treasury, like CBP, like Commerce, others when they're thinking about tariffs and sanctions.
Well, we also saw a little bit of this with the Russia sanctions, because some of the Russia executive orders that were authorized under IEEPA involved imports. I think you talked about them briefly, Laura, but I mean there were restrictions on certain Russian seafood and Russian vodka and other things like that. So the Biden administration kind of laid the groundwork for the use of IEEPA for import restrictions already. Now, tariffs are slightly different. It sounds like they were done under TWIA under President Nixon, but we've kind of already moved in that direction in the Biden administration, and so Trump's use of IEEPA wouldn't be all that much further along than the use of IEEPA under the Russian import restrictions.
That's exactly right. And even with the import restrictions, we're talking about fish and things like that. A lot of those are the enforcement of it is done in collaboration with Customs and Border Protection. So I think you would see not just enforcement on the Treasury side, but enforcement across agencies.
Especially if not now that tariff authority is pulled, as everyone is expecting, from USTR and now resides within Commerce. I think there's a possibility there to pull some kind of different set of people and different kind of a bigger brain pool to think about how to handle these issues.
Yeah, Commerce has gotten used to working with IEEPA now. I mean, that didn't happen much before President Biden's term, I don't think. But I think in connection with the Russia sanctions, Commerce has been working hand in glove with OFAC under IEEPA authorities in a way that it hadn't before. So, it might be that these new tariffs aren't that big a change if they come in and do the same thing.
Yeah.
So why don't we turn to Iran? I know that the Middle East is kind of a complete mess at this point. We've got, Israel and Lebanon that are at war. There's still the war that's going on in Gaza. Israel and Iran have been kind of at least had some bombing missions and statements that could lead to further escalation of the conflicts there. We have kind of Saudi Arabia in the background, reportedly was on the verge of recognizing Israel before the October 7th attacks. And so that whole situation is, I think it's fair to say, in turmoil and potentially in flux at this point. Iran is kind of, the sanctions against Iran have been kind of a key piece of U.S. foreign policy for quite a while, and certainly from what I've seen with the appointment of Secretary of State nominee Senator Rubio, with some of the other appointments that I've seen in the Trump administration, you'd think that this maximum pressure strategy that happened in the last Trump presidency would be continued with respect to Iran. I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of where things go with respect to Iran and whether or not there's the opportunity to bring kind of a deal out of this sort of chaos?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been a lot of talk amongst some of the appointees and Trump himself about trying to put maximum pressure on Iran, and it's really difficult to sort of see what that additional pressure looks like when Iran is so heavily sanctioned by the U.S. But part of me wonders if more of that pressure would be put on third country actors and more threats of secondary sanctions on third country actors for supporting Iran. That's where I definitely could see some of this go. But on your point of whether, there would be a deal to be made, I think certainly there had been at least some news reports that the Iranians, thought that they're willing to sort of potentially work with President Trump. I saw that in at least one news report. It's really difficult to say if they could actually get that push through. I mean, I think we talked about this on the last podcast, but it's something that President Biden had tried to do during his term, and it had quickly fallen apart. So I think it really depends on how much time President Trump wants to focus on Iran and brokering a deal during his term, knowing that he's got all of these other priorities to push through.
Right. It could be a matter of time. I mean, in his first term, there were reports that President Trump wanted to go back into negotiations with Iran, either just before or even after pulling out of the nuclear deal. That essentially, his view was that the nuclear deal was a bad deal for the U.S., but by pulling out, he just wanted to restart negotiations. But Iran at the time would have nothing to do with that, because Iran's view was that the U.S. had a deal and you can't just unilaterally pull out and renegotiate the deal. The reports now are that Iran is a potentially willing negotiation partner with President Trump. They've got a new president in place in Iran as well, and he's, by all reports, a moderate. His victory was actually a little bit of a surprise, I think, to most observers. And so he's made statements that I've seen that suggest that he wants to talk to President Trump about potential sanctions relief. Now, again, whether President Trump will have the interest this term and whether he'll have the bandwidth is another thing to be seen. But I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, I have always viewed this, and I keep saying this, and eventually it's going to be right, that it's kind of like a Nixon goes to China issue, where because President Trump is certainly not going to be accused of being soft on Iran, given his past behavior, he might be uniquely positioned to reach a deal with Iran that would stick in a way that some other presidents really haven't been, because I could see a scenario, I'm not saying this will happen, but I could see a scenario where if President Trump negotiates a deal, he actually would even be able to potentially negotiate the primary sanctions, the sanctions that have a U.S. nexus that weren't part of the nuclear deal at all, because those would require an act of Congress, but with a Republican House and a Republican Senate, and those essentially allied with President Trump in his ability to get those votes, I would think. He might be able to credibly negotiate that in exchange for more relief than just with respect to the nuclear program. Who knows? But I think he's better positioned to cut a deal than some of the other presidents have been.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, yet to be seen. I'm sure that there are a lot of senators and congressmen who are willing to bend to his wishes in that way, even though perhaps in the past they might have been considered more of an Iran hawk themselves.
All right. Well, let's turn to the Americas. And are there anything to talk about new or interesting with respect to Venezuela or with respect to Cuba?
Similar to Iran, I think that we'd seen, reports that Maduro was willing to try and negotiate with Trump. Again, whether that's something that would happen really, I think, depends on just how much time Trump has to focus on something like that. Certainly, if he's able to broker a deal that will assist with some of the, influx of migrants coming into the U.S., I think that would be seen as a positive and a win for him. And certainly if he's able to sort of couple the threat of, additional sanctions with things like tariffs when it comes to, other parts of the Americas, that's sort of this maximum pressure campaign. So I wouldn't say that, with Venezuela, for example, a deal is off the table. Again, it's just something that will take time. And I think as we'd seen in the Biden administration had also tried to issue Venezuela an olive branch with some of the licenses that came out towards the tail end of last year that were then revoked when they didn't see any change in terms of free and fair elections. So again, these things take time. And so it really depends. Is President Trump going to have a maximum pressure campaign on countries like Iran and Venezuela, or is he going to try to focus on rather instead brokering a deal that will maybe still look like he's, tough on Venezuela, but actually sort of making progress?
And finally, we've kind of got two countries left. We can talk a little bit about Cuba and a little bit about North Korea, because I know that, with North Korea, you've got President Trump's friend, Kim Il-sung, in charge still, and so maybe there's a chance for a deal. But what about Cuba? Any indication of where the Trump administration is going to go with respect to Cuba?
So I think the biggest sort of indicator is you have Senator Rubio, who is formerly family from Cuba, who has traditionally been very tough when it comes to Cuba sanctions. And so I think what you could potentially expect to see is a rollback again of some of the authorizations that the Biden administration had put in place when it comes to Cuba. And it's sort of been this flip-flop where from the Obama years, you had more lax travel authorizations and a U-turn authorizations. Then again, those were revoked by Trump, and then Biden put some of them, but not all of them, back in place. I think you could just see another Trump administration roll those back again. And it's really difficult if you're some business that was trying to do even a small piece of a little bit legitimate business in Cuba, because, now again, you're going to have to stop that.
Right. We have some clients who've been through that kind of drill back and forth where when the regs change, they've gone into Cuba, the regs come back, they get out of Cuba, the regs go back, they get into Cuba, and it's not the best situation. But I will say, the president's hands are pretty tied with respect to Cuba, with respect to pulling back, because most of the embargo has been statutorily adopted. Again, the only potential silver lining is that because Senator Rubio has been such a Cuba hawk, he might be uniquely positioned to have some sort of global, resolution of the Cuba sanctions 65 years into after their adoption. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any final words on sanctions?
One thing I did want to mention very briefly, given some recent news, is given that the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Netanyahu, since then, members of Congress, Republican members, have come out and said in the next term they would like to introduce legislation against sanctioning the ICC, which is something that we saw President Trump do by executive order during his first term. I think that is just something to be aware of and keep an eye on. More of those sanctions that target, potential what is seen as non-typical threats to the U.S. So that could likely come on day one as well. Great.
Richard, you get the final word. Let's hear, where are we going with tariffs? And I'm going to hold you to it.
Well, I don't know where we're going, but one element that I haven't mentioned that I think could be interesting is, and it's somewhere in the list of potential outcomes in this kind of choose your own adventure situation. It's the possibility of Congress legislating tariffs. This is a slower path, surely, that the president will want, but it could potentially result in a win-win if they're able to legislate on the tariffs, collect revenue through the tariffs, and use that revenue to pay for some of the tax cuts that Trump has promised. So there is mild enthusiasm around that in Congress, in part because some of his fellow Republicans do not love the idea of tariffs. But if they're happening in any event, perhaps it creates an opportunity. So I'm not sure that there will be a unified way for all the tariff-related initiatives. I think rather tariffs will appear in a number of different ways throughout the administration. In fact, I think that announcement about the tariffs on China and Mexico are not the tariffs. I think these are one variation of what will be probably a bunch of different tariff-related initiatives. And so, if things are shaping up like they are, I think we'll see just the threat of tariffs being used often as a way to try to achieve some type of negotiating objective.
Words to live by. Well, the good news about tariffs is that it gets Richard Mojica back on the pod, and hopefully this will be the first of many repeat appearances. So Richard and Laura, thank you, and thanks to everyone for listening, and stay sanctions and tariffs free.
Produced by Heartcast Media.